Okay, so like I said, I'm going to be talking about the sort of the history of these grains. Um, this picture that you're actually looking at right now are some research that's been going on recently where ethnobotanists are going back to places like the stands, like Kazakhstan, parts of Iran, other places to see what traditional farmers are doing there. So farmers that don't have access to a lot of equipment, they're doing pretty much everything by themselves. And this is what they're growing. They are growing the same crops that people were growing pretty much 10,000 years ago. And you can see there's a lot of different colors in here, not just purple and gold, but there's also some of it's green and some of it's brown. So you have different crops all together that are ripening at different rates. They're different. Some of it's barley, some of it's einkorn, some of it's wheat, and so they're growing all these crops together. And you can see it's a little bit hard to tell here, but they're super tall. They're super, the amber waves of grain, which we don't have anymore. I'll talk about that a little bit as well. It has to be hand harvested. It's a very interesting studies that are going on. And the reason people are interested in this is climate change, of course. These farmers are growing these crops where they can't grow anything else. And they're eating it, but they're also feeding it to animals. So this is drought resistant grain. So people are really interested in that. If we're just talking about the plant group itself, see if can you see that? Okay, good. So we've got about 10,000 species across 750 genera in the Poaceae, the grass family. All right, so we've got all these grass species, and they're spread across a lot of different plant types, plant groups that have different, that grow in different conditions. They're related to each other, but they're all different, right? So you've got the rice up here. This is the triticum group. These are all your wheats right here, and that's what we'll be talking about. But you also have a whole bunch of other edible plants that people have domesticated, including corn, sorghums, some other kinds of plants like oats, and a lot of other plants that I'm not as familiar with that are grown in Africa as well. So different kinds of plants, including quinoa as well. So they're not all grasses. Some of them are seeds. We call them pseudo cereals. So they're seeds that are eaten like grasses, and that's what quinoa is. We're not going to talk about any of those in this 4 series of talks. We're going to talk mainly about these plants. So you have the wheat family sort of originating about 5 million years ago. So these plants have been around for a very, very long time. So you have wild forms of these crops. So at the same time, you've got people that start to move from place to place. So we're coming out of Africa, and I'm just talking about humans, actual Homo sapiens. So these are people moving out about 200,000 years ago out of Africa, and then the colors just match how many million year or 1,000 years ago they moved out. So you don't have people moving up into the far north until just about 20,000 years ago. But you have people moving really rapidly into Southeast Asia, Southwest Asia, and then down even into Australia and East Asia as well. And if you look at what's going on at this time, as these people are moving from place to place, you've got the early Pliocene, and you can see this is basically just showing you, this would be 0 degrees Celsius, and kind of showing you how the average temperatures are changing over time and then how they get that information. So they're either using a model or they're using different kinds of data, usually from air bubbles in glaciers and things like that, and Antarctic ice, to figure out what the temperatures were likely like back then. And what we're seeing is here you've got the person with their sickle. That's about 12 to 10,000 years ago. And you see there's a change that's happening. Temperatures are cool. And then all of a sudden, the temperatures start to warm up. It gets warmer and more humid. You have all that big megafauna like mammoths. Those guys are all dying out. So this idea that you could be a very successful hunter-gatherer and get plenty of food to feed your family is changing over time. And a lot of that is due to changing climate, but it's also due to population increase. So when you look at models of population increase, it seems to show kind of just a long line where hunter-gatherer, and then you get farming and it goes zoom up. Well, those populations were increasing over time, even when people were hunter-gatherers, because for a long time, it was a very successful strategy. You have the same thing happening with these grasses. And maybe in school, you learned about this area called the Fertile Crescent. And this is an area in the Middle East, Southwest Asia area. And this is where almost all of our modern domesticated grains come from. So barley, rye, oats, wheat, they're all from this area. They all get domesticated kind of around the same time, about somewhere between 10 and 8,000 years ago. So we know we've got, so you don't have to worry about these species names or anything, but you've got this domestication period going on. And what do we know about people here? So we know we've got farmers about 10,000 years ago, but before then, we have the beginnings of domestication actually already happening. And I think when I was in high school, we never talked about that, right? So what are hunter-gatherers doing when they're gathering? They're collecting seeds and they're keeping those seeds, they're eating those seeds. And if you're smart about it, I mean, think about, there's some great books out there that talk about this, right? Guns, Germs, and Steel is kind of a classic out there. And they talk about how people actually domesticated almonds from poisonous plants into an edible plant by, tasting them. And if it tasted bad, you didn't eat those. You found one that tasted sweet. It's the same thing with plants. What do consumers want in a plant? A seed in particular. Taste. They want it to taste good, and they want it to be as big as possible, right? Bigger. It's all about bigger, better seeds. And that's selection. That is domestication. At least it's part of it. There's two parts to domestication. There's the selecting process, the seeds that you choose to eat and to plant. The other half is the cultivation part. So that's the part that's really hard to identify in the archaeological record, because the tools they're using for harvesting plants are the very same tools they would be using for planting plants. And, think about a farm field. How long is it visible in the environment when it's abandoned? Very quickly, it's going to grow over into wild back into wild plants or forest or whatever, if it's not maintained. And so we don't have that data. We've got, but now we're starting to suspect as scientists that people were doing domestication. And we do know from data collected from active hunter-gatherers, particularly in Australia and Africa, that they are planting wild plants, especially root tubers and things like that. And so they're selecting and planting. They're farming. They're just also hunter-gatherers at the same time. So again, this is kind of a big, busy slide, but it kind of gives you an indication of what's going on with all of these grassy, wheat-like plants. So we've got we've got the formation, the origination of wild emmer wheat, which is like kind of the Egyptian wheat out there. This was one of the wheats that the Romans ate, and it's already present in a wild form 800,000 years ago. So this is a long time ago. I keep sort of reiterating that. And then you've got a lot of other things going on at the same time. So there's two things with wheat plants or plants, the grains in this bigger family that are important. So if you're a wild seed, your needs are what? If you're a plant and you are wild out there in the environment and you're producing seeds, what do you want those seeds to be able to do? Germinate. Yeah, you want them to spread and get somewhere else so they can grow into plants and produce more seeds and then produce more seeds. That's what we don't want, right? We don't want these things getting spread. So most wild plants, wild peas are a classic example. Have you ever played with those little touch-me-not plants, right? That you touch the seed pod and all the seeds explode out of the plant. That's what happens with wild seeds and wild peas. Their seeds explode. We've selected for ones that don't do that. They stay in the pod. They're really nice, really easy to pick. So wild plants in the grass, these grasses, they shatter. So the seeds just break off. Nobody wants to be picking up seeds off the ground, right? You know, they get all dirty and messy. You want them to stay on that stick. And so you can just go and cut down sheaths of wheat. And so that is one of the very first things that happens. People start choosing those crazy mutations where the wheat seeds stay on the wheat stalk. Those are the ones they pick. Those are the ones they save and plant in the future. And so over time, you end up with a domestication process where you have new kinds of wheat that are emerging, that are domesticated forms of wheat. So that's one of the pieces of evidence that we look for when we can find seeds, because the wild seeds have a different little shape to them than the brittle ones, than the ones that are non-brittle. The other thing is, right, you want them to be bigger, and we already talked about that. So about 100,000 years ago, we're already finding evidence of seed consumption. And the main evidence that we're finding is in the tools that people are using. So you're actually finding grinding stones 100,000 years ago, right? We like to talk about all the spear points and all the animals people are eating. They're eating seeds as well. And they're grinding up those seeds so that they're easier to cook. A lot of it, so the earliest evidence we have is from a wild sorghum, which is a different grass. And then we're finding flat grinding stones. And we think that about 30,000 years ago, people are already making pita bread, right? On the fire, you just get a flat rock, grind up your seeds, mix it with a little water, throw it on a rock, you've got bread. It's that simple. And so we know that people were doing this in Australia with wild grasses. The first plant we see in the wheat family is in that Fertile Crescent area. So in Israel, we're finding wild barley 23,000 years ago. 14,000 years ago, we're seeing the actual first wild wheat, the barley, the beans and peas, the old world beans, and also peas. And so it just, I'll talk about some of these a little bit more. And then you get down to about 5,000 years ago. I think most of us are now familiar with Otzi the Iceman, right? They found that guy up in the Alps that had got shot in the back with an arrow. They actually have looked at his stomach contents, and his last meal was einkorn. So that's pretty neat. People, just an extensive history. So this is the 100,000 year ago example. So these grass seeds that we're finding, they find these grinding stones and these cobbles that fit together really nicely. They also have striations. Most grass plants have a lot of silica in them, which is, main component of sand, right? So if you use a stone, especially a softer stone, to process wheat over time, it gets these vertical striations in it, or swirly striations if you're going like this with it. So they find that data. The other things they find are the plant parts themselves, the leafy parts, those don't preserve this long, but starch granules do. So what you're looking at here is a starch granule. So, right, you get the little starch granules like in a potato. Every plant has a particular shape to the kinds of starch granules that it produces. So you can actually differentiate between wheat and sorghum and potatoes using that technique, which is a newer technique that people have had not thought to use. This is the Australia site, and why can I hide this? You can see here, this is the world's first bakers. So they're not, this is Australia. We don't have wheat in Australia until it's brought in by basically the colonists, the European colonists. But they had yams, a lot of root vegetables, but they were also growing different kinds of grasses as well. And so you can see here some of those striations that I was talking about on the stones. And so 65,000 years ago, we've got people baking bread, which is really cool. This is another site that's really interesting. So this is about 23,000 years ago. And there are lots and lots of these sites all over Israel, different areas. What is really interesting about this site is that the whole village was burned down for some reason. That's was really bad for them, right? Their whole village burned down unless they burned it down. But it's really good for these botanists, these archaebotanists, because whenever anything is turned into charcoal, then it preserves. It's not going to decompose anymore. And so you get really nice preservation, like whole seeds that you can put under an electron microscope and you can identify what species it is based on the shapes of the seeds, which is wonderful. They were eating, what does this look like? That picture I showed you at the very beginning. So the same kinds of groups of plants that people are collecting all kind of at the same time. In just one hut, can you imagine being the graduate student who had to do this? Some graduates students sat down in this burned down, area, and then that's been sitting there for 23,000 years and collected 90,000 seeds from one hut. They use a couple different ways to know whether people were saving those seeds or not saving those seeds, which I think is really cool. So they've got thatch roofs on the houses, right? So if it's something where the house just fell in or got destroyed by a tornado or something like that, you would expect the seeds to be just kind of everywhere, right? Just kind of a mess. But what they find is that no, these seeds are all up against where the walls of this building was. Just like if you were storing baskets or pots full of seeds, that's where the seeds are. So can imply then that they were saving these seeds, which is really a cool thing. And so they found 100 different species of wild barley and fruit, really diverse diets, really super healthy diets here. And the other evidence they did find one grinding stone that was like embedded into the ground, but they also have these really cool sickles. Again, I think these are just amazing tools that were created. They would take, instead of trying to make a giant flint sickle, by trying to use stone and flaking off pieces, they just take little pieces of flint and then they use sap and they glue them into a wood or bone that's a sickle shape. What's great about this is if it gets dull, you can replace the little pieces. So this is reusable technology that they're developing. I think sometimes we have this idea that people weren't very advanced back then, but they're using everything they've got to move as well as they can in terms of feeding their families and doing what they can to survive. And then I remember I said they were making that pita bread. Well, that's a flat bread. How much farther back can we go for like a wheat bread? It's about 14,000 years. Again, we're in a different part of that Fertile Crescent, this time in Jordan. This is the Natufians, which are a fascinating culture if you want to read about them. Here's another one of those sickles, and you can see the little pieces of flint in there, and they're collecting wild wheat, barley, bulrush roots. That I think this is interesting too. A lot of these cultures, they're collecting seeds, but they're also collecting some kind of tubery thing, like a potatoy thing. And what I don't know what archae foodies, I don't know what you would call these people that study how people were preparing food back in the day, but they think that the reason they're mixing these together is because it makes a paste and makes a better thing. Because if you just mix water and grain and you can't grind it really, really fine, it's going to kind of be fragile and break apart. So that may be what they're doing. Of course, that's we don't know that for sure, of course. Again, it's a flatbread. There's no fermentation. So people aren't using yeast yet at all. About 11,000 years ago, again, or so, we've got people that are growing. This plant is actually goat grass. So the wheats are down in that Fertile Crescent. So we're up in the Balkans now, but there's wild grasses up there too, wild predecessors of wheat. So Agelops is one of the plants that combines with another grass to come up with what we call wheat today. And again, you can see they're looking at edges, scraping, starch granules, but now they're actually picking the tartar off of people's teeth that they find back there. And that's where they're finding these starch granules and evidence of other bits and pieces of stuff they're eating. And in some cases, they can actually get DNA information as well from this tartar. There's a lot of issues with contamination, but they can tell what kinds of animals they were eating without actually seeing what kinds of bones the animals are producing. So they're getting really sophisticated over time. The other issue that we have with these grains, so I said that I talked about the brittleness, right? They have a tendency to break off. The very first thing that people do in domestication is get rid of that, because that's terrible work to try to deal with. The second thing they have to deal with is how do you get the hard husks off individual seeds? So if you buy wheat today, we call it naked or unhulled. It doesn't have these hard, woody husks on the outside. So if you look at here, let's look at oats in the middle here. Here you're seeing the oat grains with the husks on the outside. This is what oat groats look like. So before they get rolled, this is a naked oat basically. And then you've got all these husks that come off of there. In wild plants, these are typically really stuck on there tight because they don't want insects and other pests to be able to get into that yummy seed on the inside. They want them to be protected against fungi and climate issues, and they want them to be able to survive from year to year. Having those husks is really important from the wild plant's perspective. Having those husks is really awful from the human domesticator's perspective. So this is the second thing people get rid of, is they start looking for those off chance individuals, mutants in the population that don't have these big husks. So that's the next thing that people do. And once they do that, it's all good. That we haven't done much else to wheat plants except make them shorter because they're easier to deal with machinery. So we get these short wheats in the 1960s, right? Borgland's Green Revolution. Those are those short wheats because they're just easier to deal with. And plus, if you got big long stalks, that's energy that's not going into seeds that you can't eat. So it's better to have shorter plants that can put more energy into seeds. Another thing that has happened really, really recently is people are now thinking, again, I talked about that a little bit earlier, and I probably should have had these two slides together, but they think that maybe some of these grasses were actually domesticated. Things like acorn was domesticated instead of like 10,000 years ago, more like 30,000 years ago. And the reason that they're saying that is that they're basing these again on Fertile Crescent sites in Syria, 13,000-year-old these are hunter-gatherers, they're not farmers, but they're finding non-shattering forms of emmer and acorn at those sites. So these guys have been choosing non-shattering forms for a very long time. So, and the way that they're estimating this 30,000 years, how do you go from 13,000 to 30,000? They're actually using modeling where they're looking at how quickly can those gene frequencies of shattering to non-shattering, how long does that change happen genetically? So this is not a wild guess, it's an educated guess, but it's definitely a guess. There's no archaeological data here to support any of this. So but I think it's going to be really interesting. There's been this very consistent pushing backwards of domestication over the last 20 years, over the last 10 years, which I think is absolutely fascinating, right? That we were doing this stuff a long time ago, long before we became farmers. And that's actually really important too, because it's not hard to become a farmer then. If you're already doing all the stuff a farmer does, and you just stay with the crops, you're a farmer. You're no longer a hunter-gatherer. And that's basically what happens. The other thing I actually am going to skip this. We'll talk about that next time. There's a really complicated genetics that happens with wheats where they duplicate their genome. So we have like one set of genes from our mom and one set of genes from our dad. Well, sometimes that replication process doesn't happen right. And so you make an egg with, instead of making an egg with half, it has the full complement. So instead of being, so we're 2N, right? We have two sets of chromosomes. There are lots of wheats that are 4N or 6N. Bananas, the bananas we eat, the reason they're seedless is they're 3N. So plants do this all the time. There's kind of a weird, I don't know, urban legend out there, sort of misinformation out there that that's why modern wheat is so bad for you. It's because it's hexaploid, which sounds kind of scary, but that just means there's 6 copies of the genes in that plant. Those plants did that themselves. We maybe helped them along a little bit, but it's not like some ancient hunter-gatherer farmer was out there like saying, if I could get these genomes to like mix together, right? They had no idea. They were just collecting bigger, better seeds that didn't fall off the plant. That's all they cared about. So let's come back to Medland. So this is what that polyculture, that was that first picture I showed you. All these different varieties of wild einkorn, that's probably some kind of wild einkorn or wheat, barley, other plants as well that grow together. They've always grown together in a field together, along with kind of weedy things like peas, those vetches, right? That's kind of the scourge of our gardens, right? Today you get these crazy vetch plants that take over. But the great thing about vetch seeds is what? They're peas, they're bean family. They're really high in protein and high in fiber. So they're not bad to eat along with it. So they're making these mixes of grains, and this is what they're eating. What's nice about this is that instead of like when you collect potatoes and other kinds of tubers, they've got a limited shelf life, right? You can keep them for a while, but not over years and years. If you store your wheat, and people, Amish people, the LDS, Latter-day Saints have been doing this for years. They actually, if you store wheat in an air-free environment, like a can or a container that has iron filings in it in little packets to take the oxygen out, you can store that for years and years and years and years. And so as long as you keep it dry and keep the bugs away, you can store this crop. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful crop. Some others are good, like corn is another crop that does this really well. So it provides a very stable food source. And the other thing about planting a mix is you've got sort of versatility. So if one of them has an off year, gets killed by a fungus, the other ones won't probably because they're a different species. So even if you lose part of your crop, if you're growing a bunch of things together, polyculture, you're very likely to still survive. You're going to have food. If all you grow is one kind of wheat in a field and you get some kind of crazy aphid in there and it kills everything, then you're in trouble. The other thing is it's healthy. You've got lots of nutrition in these mixed grains, like I alluded to, but also we've always been foodies. I think that's kind of a misnomer or idea people have had out there is that, food tasted terrible when we were hunter-gatherers. These people were adding spices. If you look at indigenous menus, and I encourage you to go to any Native American restaurant if you can, that's cooking indigenous foods. They are really tasty, wonderful menus. And so we were adding spices, doing all the things that chefs do today, back then as well. So that was important. It tasted good. So I want to talk a little bit in the time I have left about some of these plants. So we've got barley. This is one of the original plants from the Fertile Crescent. It's lasted for a really long time because it's drought resistant. And we have different kinds. There's 2-row or 6-row barley. The preference seems to be related to sort of background. So people in Europe, and now I'm forgetting which is which. I think people in Europe like 2-row and we like 6-row. I don't remember, something like that. So you can make it into bread, you can feed it to animals, and most importantly, you can make it into beer. So how long have we been making beer out of barley? At least 13,000 years. So again, once again, these are hunter-gatherers. You have a hard day out foraging, hunting, you want to come home and have some beer, right? And probably used for religious ceremonies as well, and for probably as a kind of a health tonic or for sick individuals as well. The way that they did brewing was in 3 different stages. They would sprout the grains to create the malt. What is that doing? Does anybody a home brewer here? Why do you sprout the barley? You want to sprout it. So in just a teeny weeny little bit, you just want to see that little tip of the plant starting to come out of the seed itself. This activates an enzyme that starts to convert that starch into sugar. So malted barley is simply sprouted barley that's been dried again. And a lot of people do this, even people who do like their own home milling, they'll sprout their grain, they'll dry it in a dehydrator, and then they'll mill it. And it changes the enzymatic composition of the grain, makes some of those nutrients more available, and also makes it taste a little bit different, a little bit sweeter. So that's really important. So they're sprouting grains, and then they're mashing and heating it, and then they're just putting it out there and letting those wild yeasts that are out there in the air anyways to colonize this in these stone mortars. And these still exist. So these are 13,000-year-old beer barrels, basically, that people are growing this in. The one bad thing about this is probably a porridge consistency. So they either had to figure out some way to strain it to get a liquid, but it's probably more likely that they were just eating it. So it's not like a nice crispy beer like we think of. It's like a bowl of beer porridge. And people still, even in the Middle Ages, were eating this kind of a thing and feeding animals this kind of a thing as well. There's sites in Western Iran 5,400 years ago, again, charred barley grain. And this time they're actually finding these calcium oxalate ions, which are residues in these containers. And when that gets in the grooves, when you get that calcium oxalate, we know fermentation has been happening because it's the formation of alcohol that actually produces that. In China, 5,000 years ago, same kind of chemical residues on pottery in China, and they're using barley and also millet and rice. So they're already making sake, rice wines. And then, of course, in Mesopotamia, this is where we used to think was the very first production of beer. But that's not that long ago. The oldest recipe for beer is shown right here. It's a cuneiform, I think I'm pronouncing that right, recipe on a piece of stone, a Sumerian text for making barley and date flavored beer. So pretty cool. And I know that if you watch YouTube videos and you just look up ancient food history, people are making this stuff all over the internet. And so you can find some really cool old recipes. Einkorn, or Eichhorn, people spell it different ways, is a diploid form. I'm going to talk a lot more about these next week. I just wanted to give you an idea of what they looked like. So this is one of the first wild grains that people are growing in the Fertile Crescent. It's very low yielding. It has a tendency to grow really tall, and then it has a tendency, if the winds blow too high, it falls over, and I've forgotten the name for that. There's a specific word for that, where it falls over and then it can get moldy. It's harder to harvest coming through with a sickle. Um, and they actually, when they had this happen in their fields, they would get their little kids out there and make the little kids like lean up against the stuff so that they could slice them. Can you imagine how dangerous that probably was? But it's supposed to have, it has a really, really nice flavor to it. It doesn't make gluten the right way, but a lot of people describe it as tasting like, it's very sweet, buttery, and it kind of smells like kettle corn. That sounds good to me. So there's two species. There's a wild form and a domesticated form, of course. It's about 9,000 years we start to see the domesticated form still mixed in with the wild forms. Again, it has these big, hard husks. That was the bigger problem with it. It's lower yield, but it does well in cool, wet conditions. So this is one of the grains that moved north into Europe, and they were growing in the Middle Ages because it would survive there. Whereas like emmer wheat, that Mesopotamian wheat, Egyptian wheat, Roman wheat, it doesn't like it up there in Europe. It's just too wet and damp and cold. It does require traditional farming methods. You cannot, and this is probably the most expensive grain you can buy as a baker, because it's expensive to process, because you got to get those husks off, and that takes a lot of effort. It's harder to harvest. You can't just go in with a combine or whatever and harvest it. Rye, and I'm not going to talk about triticale. I'll talk about that a little bit next time. But you can see rye again is where you've got places where people are growing wheat and rye together. Rye was probably a weed to begin with that came in as people were domesticating the other plants, the einkorn and the wheats and the barley. The rye was there, but we can eat that too. Well, we're not going to like try to pull it out of the fields. And then as these plants moved north, it's again frost resistant. So if your emmer wheat dies, your rye probably isn't going to. So this is one of the plants you see. This is what the Vikings are growing, right? In Scandinavia in the Middle Ages, because that is a plant very high in nutrients, very high in minerals. It does have a really earthy taste to it, but it makes kind of hard, lumpy bread. It doesn't have good gluten formation. And really, it's all about bread. The wheats that people want are the ones that make a nice, fluffy bread. So we have all kinds of flatbreads. Every culture has a flatbread of one type or another, but people like fluffy bread, and they like light colored bread, right? They don't want heavy, dark, black breads. They want breads that are nice and poofy. So spelt, one of our earliest wheats, makes a really nice loaf of bread. And then you've got modern, hard red wheat. This is what most farmers are growing out in Montana, areas like that, is a winter wheat, hard winter wheat. Here you've got emmer wheat. So this is the very first wheats after einkorn. Again, it does not make a very good loaf of bread. This is the Egyptian wheat. And a lot of that was a flatter kind of bread. So these are the kinds of loaves that they're making early on with emmer. A lot of times putting in other kinds of ingredients. So in this case, using a lot of lentils. And it's fermented on leaves. So the leaves are providing that wild yeast. And then it's baked on stones, and it poofs up like a pita bread again. So they're puffy, but they're not. It's not like a nice slice of bread. And they're actually growing this, and we know that this is how they were growing this bread, and we've been able to replicate this loaf because archaeologists found one from a site where somebody had purposely probably burned the loaf and then buried it under the threshold of the house, which is something people have done in Europe and other places as well for centuries. So this idea of blessing the house with a loaf is very common. So here's that emmer wheat. It's preferred over einkorn or barley. It has a better consistency. It has a high yield in infertile areas, and it's durable against some frost, some disease. But again, it's not great for bread. This is what is made into bulgur. If you've ever had tabbouleh, that's bulgur. So they basically parboil the whole grains and then dry them and crack them and then boil them again. So that, again, this pita-like bread, porridges were made. This is what the Roman army marched on, was emmer wheat. So we talk sometimes about Romans eating a lot of barley. They did get a ration of barley as well, but that typically was fed probably to horses, or it was traded for, they could trade with locals their barley ration and get some cash and maybe, buy a bottle of beer or something. So the only Romans that were eating barley were the ones who weren't up to snuff. So if you did, they had to demonstrate their sword skills or whatever, and if your supervisor didn't like it, you were on barley rations for a month. And so you can tell this is how different the flavor profiles of these two grains is. They really wanted emmer, so they could use it as a punishment, actually. As they moved north, the Romans took a lot of these grains with them, and of course, they got spread all over the place. Traders, spelt, here's one of those hexaploid crops. Comes in a lot of different forms. This is a modern wheat, and then this is spelt on this side. So you can see the difference between modern wheat and spelt. Less productive, heavier husks on it, but still a good form of food. It was really high in protein. Again, not a great bread. Not compared to wheat, it's not as good, but it'll make a nice loaf. It's high in fiber, and this is what most Romans were eating, unless you were the highest of the highest. So the aristocrats are eating fancy wheat. Most of the rest of the population of free people are eating spelt. The soldiers are eating some barley, and then the slaves were eating a lot of barley as well. So, and then we have durum wheat, which is another of the older forms from the Fertile Crescent. This is our hardest wheat. And again, I'll talk more about the differences between these as well. Domesticated about 9,000 years ago, but I'm throwing out a lot of names, right? Durum, spelt, einkorn, they're all wheats. They're different species or different varieties, but they're all very closely related to each other. And again, you have spelt here. This is what it looks like in the field. And then you've got common wheat here. So you get a lot more productivity in common wheat. So this is common wheat. This is what, if anybody says this is modern wheat, this is modern wheat. This is the wheat. It's 10,000 years old, 9,000 years old. Modern wheat is the same wheat, whether it's we've bred short varieties, tall varieties, purple varieties, but we've done that with all of them, right? You can buy all different colors of einkorn, barley, and those as well. So we see it actually becoming very, very common about 6,000 to 9,000 years ago. And they discovered this first in modern day Georgia, over in the Russian area in Asia. And this is what we eat today. So it's a hybrid between a domesticated tetraploid wheat, again, it's a little bit weird, and a wild goat grass. So again, this is probably happening. The wheats are probably doing this themselves. One thing I didn't mention, grasses are wind pollinated. So you don't have to have bees. You don't have to have people out there with their little Q-tips out there putting pollen on one plant or another. If they're in a field together and they're closely enough related, you're going to get some crossing over and forming of new hybrids. If those hybrids keep producing in a field, eventually over time, they stabilize. We today often call that kind of a variety that's stable an heirloom or a heritage form. So that these would be equivalent to then. I talked about the Romans already, but this just kind of gives you an idea of what the Romans were doing. Again, barley, not their favorite. Spelt was their favorite. And this is what a Roman loaf looked like. So we have lots of these from Pompeii, right? So we know exactly what they were eating, how it was produced, and people did not bake their own bread in Pompeii or Rome or any of these large Roman communities. They had bakeries. Slaves were baking the bread, sometimes locked into very small rooms, turning grindstones, breathing in all of that wheat dust, and then baking at very high temperatures. And then you would go every day and you'd buy your loaf of bread. I think that whole development of bakeries very early on is really interesting. So after all of that, and I know I went through that very quickly, but we'll come back to this next time, is a whole different selection of different kinds of grains that we can use for all kinds of things, from making beautiful loaves of bread to making porridge and pancakes and pita bread and beer, right? It really was a wonder crop when you think about it, and really important in terms of what's going on. So this is we don't have to worry about this right now. We'll talk about that next time. So this is one of our heirloom wheats. This is one you'll probably hear about. This is the wheat that became very, very popular in the Western United States. So before that, they were growing wheats that do really well in places like Italy. And then they brought those over. These were mostly spring wheats. So you can either plant in the spring or you can plant in the fall. If you have a really short growing season, it's better to plant in the fall because it does some of its development and then it's ready to go in the spring. If you plant in the spring, then you've got to wait for it to germinate. It takes a lot longer. And so they were growing spring wheats until the Mennonites brought over this winter wheat from the Ukraine, and that was the top wheat grown in the United States from the late 1800s up through the 1940s. That was the wheat we grew, was turkey red winter wheat. Lodging. That's that word I couldn't think of. So when they flop over like that, that's lodging. And so if you over fertilize this, it tends to put all its energy into a big long stem and it flops over. And that's terrible for machinery. Again, a pretty high high protein. It's great. It's a great wheat for making bread. And then we've got a lot of new wheats coming out. We do not have GMO wheat in production in the world, except on experimental plots. But China really, really, really is working on this hard for two reasons. One, they want to be able to spray weeds in the field, just like we do with soybeans. So having those Roundup ready or glyphosate ready crops, they want that. We want that over here. But they want drought resistant crops. So they're trying to put genes from some of these wild grasses that do well in really droughty places and going into those maizelands that people are growing in Kazakhstan and Iran, pulling genes out of those plants and then putting them directly into some of these red wheats and trying to get that to go. So it's coming. So this GMO wheat is coming. This is confused by what are called synthetic wheats. That doesn't mean it's GMO. That means they took a wheat and they crossed it with some unrelated grass, but they were able to get them to grow and hybridize and produce seeds. So we've got some of these synthetic wheats out there, and then there's some weird mutated wheats. We do this a lot with fruit, citrus fruit especially. So ruby reds, those were produced by exposing yellow grapefruits to seeds to some kind of a chemical. And then it produced mutants that then produced the ruby red. So we've been doing, again, it's not something that's brand new. We've been doing this for a while. We have one called HB4. This is the one that people are most interested in. It's a GMO wheat where they've taken a sunflower gene and they've added it to wheat to improve its drought resistance. So you can see here's the unimproved versus the GMO wheat in the same field. So we don't know what's going to happen there. And then finally, there are people that are really, really interested in trying to develop perennial wheat. So all the plants I've talked about, these are all plants. They have a seed, they sprout, they grow up, they produce seeds and die all in one season, just like a lot of our food crops do. But people are like, well, you know, if we could get a wheat where we could just cut it and then it stays like sod grass, it'll protect the soil. You won't get another dust bowl like we had in the past. It'll be drought resistant. It'll be great. So there have been people working, particularly in Kansas, at the Land Institute to try to develop it. It's not a wheat. It's a grass. It's a different genus. It's not triticum. It's Binoprium pyrum. I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's called Kernza. That's the name you'll see. There are farms in the area that are growing some of this now. The problem with it is it does grow these really deep roots. It's high in protein. It can make a good loaf of bread. It just doesn't. Think about the plant again and what its motivations are. If you're perennial and you can sit there for years and years and years and conditions aren't changing and you've got these super deep roots, why would you put a lot of energy into seeds? That's what they're seeing. Plants have no motivation to actually produce seeds. Just sort of figure that out. You know, they're doing lots of active selection process. Domestication continues, right? And trying to find a wheat that is going to be the wheat of the future. That's where people are right now. Because we're still growing the same wheat that hasn't basically changed since about 1965. That's what we're growing in the United States today and around the world. But again, there are lots of different grains out there. And again, Kernza, Uh, there are Kernza beers you can buy out there. I know there's one that comes out of Portland. So a lot of it, because there's not very much of it available, it's become like a specialty item. So you can charge a lot more. You got added value, right? Farmers talk about added value. Well, if you've got a dairy farm, you can sell the milk, or you can make cheese on your farm and sell that for a lot more. Well, you can grow Kernza, but if you can turn that kernza into beer, you can sell it for a lot more money than if you're selling flour. So that's what people have been doing. Uh, I know I went overtime. I'm terrible about that, but I did have a little technical problem there at the beginning. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them now or stay and talk to people. And I will be back next week talking about what's great about why do we have that whole giant circle? Why didn't we just focus on one thing and grow that? Well, they all have different uses. So they grow better in different places. All kinds of really interesting things.